Welcome to the sixth episode of our show, The Second Sex, where we explore Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking work and its lasting impact on feminist thought.
Hello. Yes, today we're getting into a really key part of her argument.
We're diving deep into Part 2, History, Chapter 1 of The Second Sex, specifically pages 95 through 100.
Right. And this is where Beauvoir really starts to trace the roots, historically speaking, of male dominance.
And that idea of woman as the other, which is so central to her work.
Exactly. She's looking at the earliest human societies to figure out, well, how did this all begin? How did this dynamic get set up?
It's quite the excavation. So our goal here is to really unpack her thinking on how this power imbalance originated and, evolves over time.
We'll look at her points on biology, economics, the whole other concept.
And also that fascinating bit about early goddess worship, which might seem counterintuitive at first.
It can, yeah. These are definitely big ideas, and maybe a bit challenging if you haven't encountered them before.
But we want to make them accessible. Yeah. Hopefully spark some of those aha moments for you listening.
Without it feeling like a dense academic lecture. That's the plan.
Okay, so let's start where Beauvoir starts. She talks about the biological and economic situation of primitive hordes. What's the core idea there?
Essentially, she's arguing that the biological realities were different from the get-go, particularly motherhood.
Right, the demands of bearing and raising children.
Yeah. She suggests this tied women more directly to the needs of the species, making them, in her words, more prey to the species.
She uses that striking phrase, riveted to her body like the animal.
She does. It's meant to contrast with men's experience.
Because men, through developing tools and hunting perhaps, could engage more with the external world.
Precisely. They could engage in what she calls activity and project, acting on the world, not just being subject to biological cycles.
It's about transcending immediate needs then, moving beyond just survival.
Exactly. And Beauvoir thinks this is crucial. Humanity starts questioning its own existence, looking for reasons for living, not just life itself.
And in that shift, she argues, men's activities hunting, building, fighting, maybe started to be seen as defining what existence is.
Yeah, defining value. Men's actions were seen as creating value, projecting into the future, conquering the moment.
While women's roles, associated with birth and nurturing, were seen as more repetitive, tied to the cycles of life.
That seems to be her interpretation, that male activity creating values has constituted existence itself as a value.
And through that, it prevailed over the indistinct forces of life. And it has subjugated nature and woman. That's a powerful statement.
It really is. It sets up this idea that the hierarchy wasn't just physical strength, but about defining what counts as meaningful existence.
Okay, so that's the biological and economic foundation she lays. How does this lead into the concept of woman as the other?
Well, Beauvoir argues that defining oneself always involves defining something else the other. Man never thinks himself without thinking the other, she writes.
So we need contrast to understand ourselves.
Kind of, yeah. But she says this other wasn't initially gendered. It wasn't automatically woman.
Oh, interesting. What was it then?
It could be nature, the unknown, cosmic forces. She mentions ancient cosmologies where you might have, say, the ocean represented as a single entity with both male and female aspects.
Like a unified chaos, maybe?
Something like that. A duality, but not necessarily split along male-female lines in the way we think of it now.
So how did woman end up occupying that other category so completely in her view?
As societies developed and roles became more distinct, Beauvoir suggests woman's perceived difference, especially her biological functions, made her the prime candidate for this category of other.
Because she was seen as fundamentally different from the male self who's doing the defining.
That's the idea. She was naturally different from man, who posits himself as the same, and over time, this identification solidified.
To the point where woman came to represent almost the entire region of the other?
Yes. And paradoxically, this also led to the emergence of powerful feminine deities, often linked to fertility in nature's cycles, because the other holds a certain mysterious power.
Right, which brings us to the great goddess figures. Archaeology seems to back this up, doesn't it? Discoveries in places like Susa and Crete.
Absolutely. We find these incredible representations, the Great Mother, the Great Goddess.
What did they look like? What were their characteristics?
Well, they varied. Sometimes depicted in long robes, elaborate hairstyles, maybe wearing crowns like towers, sometimes stetopigics, meaning large hips and buttocks suggesting fertility.
But sometimes thin? clothed or naked.
Yes, quite diverse portrayals, often with prominent breasts, again linking to life-giving, nurturing aspects.
And Beauvoir describes her as incredibly powerful, not just a fertility figure.
Definitely not. Queen of Heaven, associated with the dove, but also Empress of Hades, linked to the serpent. Power over life and death.
Present in nature, creator, destroyer. Sounds quite formidable.
Very. Both propitious and dangerous, fickle, lascivious, cruel, all these potent, sometimes contradictory qualities.
And she reigned over huge areas, right, under different names.
Huge areas. Asia Minor, Phrygia, Syria, Anatolia. Names like Ishtar, Astarte, Cybele, Isis. And crucially, male gods were often secondary to her.
So does this mean women on Earth reflected this divine power? Was it a time of matriarchy?
Well, Beauvoir notes that women in these societies were often surrounded by taboos, seen as having special magic, involved in rituals, maybe even some governance roles. Priestesses, for sure.
Sounds like they held considerable status.
They certainly seem to, but this is where Beauvoir adds a really crucial layer of complexity.
Okay. She doesn't think it was true female power.
Not in the sense of men actually relinquishing their fundamental position. She argues that even when men were, terrified by women's dangerous magic
Right.
and worshipped her as essential, it was still men doing the defining, the worshiping, the positing of her power.
So by defining her power, even as something awesome or scary, they were still implicitly framing it, controlling the narrative.
Exactly. By granting her this status as other, even a powerful other, man was simultaneously realizing himself as the essential being who could recognize and categorize this power.
It's like the way we might respect a storm's power, but still see ourselves as the observers, the ones who name it and understand it.
That's a good analogy. Beauvoir uses the earth itself. Man sees himself mastering the fertile earth, and woman, embodying that fertility, is similarly destined, in this mindset, for possession and exploitation, even if revered.
So the prestige was real but conditional, dependent on male consciousness.
That's her argument. The idols were powerful, but ultimately their power was granted and could, theoretically, be taken away by the consciousness that created them.
A consciousness that was, she argues, predominantly male.
Yes. And she suggests this dependence, maybe implicit at first, becomes much clearer as men develop a stronger sense of self, of their own agency.
And start to assert themselves against that earlier reverence.
Precisely. Which leads towards the patriarchal structures we see emerging more strongly later.
Okay, so let's talk about that shift. How did societies move towards more explicitly patriarchal forms, according to Beauvoir?
As societies got more complex, agriculture developed, property became more important. Men's control over resources and the means of production increased.
And this affected family structures and marriage?
Absolutely. She looks at early marriage customs. Sometimes wives were literally bought or exchanged for goods between clans. It highlights women being treated as, property?
Objects of exchange rather than equal partners.
Pretty much. And the roles of husband and father gained importance, sometimes creating conflict with older, perhaps matrilineal clan loyalties.
Beauvoir also mentions the different value placed on children, right, depending on their sex.
Yes, tragically. Things like female infanticide or the idea that accepting a girl baby was an act of generosity by the father.
That really underscores a perceived lesser value.
It does. And systems like blood money, where the compensation for killing a woman was less than for a man, reinforce that.
So this idea of female inferiority gets baked into the social and economic system.
And consolidated through the father's power. He essentially owned his daughters until he transferred that ownership to a husband through marriage.
Which connects to practices like polygamy.
Right. If women are property, a man can accumulate more than one. But at the same time, there's a demand for absolute chastity from those wives.
Why the double standard?
Primarily concerns about inheritance, ensuring that children are legitimately the husband's to pass property and status down the male line.
Which wasn't necessarily the case in some earlier systems. She contrasts it with potentially more freedom in matriarchal setups.
She suggests that yes, where lineage might have been traced differently, or where women weren't solely defined by their relationship to one man, there might have been less emphasis on premarital chastity or stricter adultery rules for women.
But under patriarchy, female adultery becomes a major transgression.
A huge one. Seen as a violation of the husband's property rights. Beauvoir points to historical laws, even up to the Napoleonic Code, being surprisingly lenient towards husbands who took violent revenge for infidelity.
It's a stark picture of control. So Women lost whatever autonomy they might have had when they belonged perhaps to both a father's clan and a husband's family.
And became fully subjugated under this consolidating patriarchal regime, owned by the father, then married off.
Okay, so let's try and bring this section together. We've covered Beauvoir's ideas on the biological and economic origins,
The way woman became constructed as the other.
the complexities around the great goddess worship, where female power seemed prominent but was maybe still framed by men,
Right, that underlying male power persisting.
and then the clear shift towards patriarchy, with men asserting more direct control over women's lives and bodies.
It's a dense few pages, but she lays out a powerful historical argument for how these inequalities became so deeply embedded.
It really makes you think. And that leads us to a question for you listening at home. How do you see these historical dynamics, the ones Beauvoir outlines here, still playing out today?
Do those categories of self, the default, the norm, and the secondary still shape our understanding of gender, even subconsciously?
It's definitely something to consider.
And maybe one final thought to leave you with. If, as Beauvoir argues, the idea of woman as this fixed other was constructed through history, through specific conditions, does understanding that history give us tools? Does it open up possibilities for challenging and maybe even dismantling those categories to find new ways of relating and being?
A really provocative question. Beauvoir certainly thought understanding the past was key to changing the future. This section definitely sets the stage for everything that follows in her analysis.